Good afternoon, everyone. Hi, welcome to the webinar. My name's Simon Blanchard. I'm a partner at Data Protection Network Associates. So a bit about DPN for those who don't know DPN. We publish lots of very practical guidance and articles on our website for a range of organisations, large and small, across all sorts of different sectors. And so you can find, anything else that you'd like to know about us really on our website, dpnetwork.org.uk. So I'm going to pop a few slides on, first of all, if that's okay, just to kind of introduce ourselves and the session that we're going to talk about today. They should just be appearing on the screen right now. So our topic for the webinar today is unlocking successful data governance and accountability. And we've got a great team of people here to talk you through this today. So we'll do some introductions in just a moment, but I would just want to give you a few intros, which is that the webinar itself is being recorded today. So if you would like to view it again, you'll be able to do so afterwards. You'll get an email about this time tomorrow, comes out about 4 p.m. GMT. Tomorrow afternoon, you'll get an email with a link to view the recording that you can use yourself or pass on if you wish. Many of you, I know, have already submitted questions in advance, which is really wonderful. Thank you very much if you've done that. If you've not given us any questions in advance, you'll find that there is actually a chat button that you can use. If you want to click the chat button, you'll then be able to kind of raise your question that we will see here, that all of us on the panel can see the questions. So we'll just aim to get through as many as we can today. I'd like to say also a big thank you to our sponsors today, who are ComplyKey. Just going to pop onto the slide there. So ComplyKey is all about cracking compliance and empowering data, which enables you to digitalize your compliance and data management with ComplyKey. And give your organisation seamless e-discovery, efficient data retention, redaction, and a range of comprehensive data compliance modules, consultancy and training. Okay, so without further ado, I'd like to hand over to Robert now, who's going to be our chair for today. Robert.
Thank you, Simon, and thank you everybody for being on the webinar today. I'm a senior counsel with Privacy Partnership Law. I'm also external data protection officer to a number of organisations, and I'm also a industry commissioner with the Data and Marketing Commission. So I'm very much looking forward to hearing what the panel will be saying about this topic today. I'm going to come to Maria in a minute, but I'd like to ask Mark from ComplyKey just to say a few words and then come back to me.
Thanks very much. Hi, everybody. Mark here from ComplyKey. I'm the Client Relations Director for the organisation. And we have about 600 clients in the UK and Ireland running our software. Recently enough, we've evolved our software really to be a workflow solution for the complete compliance space. So again, as at the end of this presentation, I'll touch on some of the difficulties around managing our policies, procedures, our workflows in the jobs that you guys currently have, and where technology can help be an enabler to that process. So I'll touch on that in a bit more detail near the end of the presentation. Thanks.
Thank you, Mark. And Simon, you've obviously introduced yourself. So I'm going to now hand over to Maria from GB Bank. And do introduce yourself, Maria, and then I think you're going to start off with some thoughts on data governance.
Thank you, Robert. Yes, I'm Maria. I currently work for GB Bank. I have been with GB Bank since December 2020 as their Head of Information Management and Data Protection Officer. So I do wear two hats. Previous to GB Bank, I did work in a very established organisation, again for nearly 10 years in the same role. But GB Bank is Britain's second newest bank. So very interesting to go to an organisation right from the beginning and basically begin given a blank piece of paper to develop the data governance framework. So that's what I'm going to talk about today, is my experience in working in a brand new organisation and how I was gifted with developing the framework by myself. So again, I've spoken to the fact that I've got two hats, and it's about where data protection and data governance fit in with each other. So data protection, for those people who work in privacy, will understand that it's all about the processing of personal data in accordance with data protection legislation. Data governance is different though. Data governance is about managing your critical data assets in a very structured way to ensure that you harness the benefits of data and drive your organization forward. Data is king, it's a revolution, and it's out there. And I'm sure most people on this webinar understand that. Critical data assets. What are actually critical data assets? Critical data assets is the data, the important data in an organization that does drive your business forward. Information governance is very different to data governance, although they are linked again. Information governance is a broader scope and it encompasses all the data that you process within an organization, including your critical data assets. So why do we need a framework? Why is it important? And if you look at the left-hand side of the slide, you will understand why. If you don't have a framework, what happens is that you run the risk of making your critical data assets unavailable, unusable. It lacks integrity. They are not secure and they're not legislatively compliant. So what elements and components do actually build a framework? And I have jotted the most important 5 down. And it's important to understand that there's not one size fits all organisation. These are my important 5. So policies, you have to have the right policies in place to be able to manage your critical data assets. Within GB Bank, what we have is we have a 4-tier structure around policies. So we have a board policy. A board policy is very important. It's owned by the board. It's a statement of intent and it sets out why you process data in a certain way. The Tier 2 policy is executive owned and it actually tells you what you will do. And it's very much linked with legislation and regulation. Tier 3 is what's owned by your subject matter experts. And that can actually be considered a process too. And then your Tier 4 is about your tools, your organisation, your desk aids, anything, again, quick reference guides that will make the processing of data easy. Processes we've touched on. These are your level 2 processes where your SME complete. They're basically for your staff to pick up and to review. And for that reason, you must make sure that they are very easy to locate. They're very easy to read, very easy to understand, and that they are reviewed on a regular basis as your business grows or the direction of your business changes. Very important that the staff on the ground know exactly what they need to do. In relation to organisational design, again, very, very important. So what we do at GB Bank is that we have allocated data roles to significant individuals within the organisation to help develop the framework and embed the framework. These roles and responsibilities, we have 4. The first one is an information asset owner, sometimes called an as a data asset owner as well. These are our executive team members. These are individuals who are responsible for fostering a really positive culture around data within their part of the organisation. They're there to understand what IT assets they actually have and therefore what data assets they actually have, to ensure the risks associated around those data assets to the organisation and to mitigate those risks. The next role that we have, sometimes called a data steward, we actually call them data managers. So these data managers, their roles are usually the head of a particular department. So they work underneath the executive team member and they provide the information asset owner the assurances that they need that their data is being processed correctly in accordance with guidance, according with policy, to provide the figures, the EMI that they need. Their data is reliable, it's trustworthy, it has integrity. They ensure that the access controls are in place and that is restricted on a need-to-know basis. And they also work with the likes of the DPO to harness privacy within their processing activities, to make sure the documents like the DPIA and the ROPA are actually completed. The next one, very interesting one, is technical custodian. Technical custodian is not a data asset owner. They don't own the data. What they do is they own the system. So they ensure that the systems that are used to process data are being used to the best of the organization's ability. All the the technical elements of that system, they harness it and it's driving the business forward. They also should know the risks around that technical system also, and as I say, the full functionality of the system. Another role that may not be in organisations, but it is one to think about, is a end-to-end asset owner. So you do have some systems that run right across an organisation, and therefore the information asset owner can only be responsible for the data that is input within their area of business and not right across the business. And if I give you an example, an HR system. An HR system runs right across the business, but an individual information asset owner can only be responsible for the data they input in there in relation to their area of business. So what you do need is you need an end-to-end asset owner. Their job is slightly different from an information asset owner. Their job is to introduce standards to ensure they harness data quality, to ensure data retention dates are set, to ensure that MI reporting can be extracted from that system, and also to make sure that the system is administered properly. So those are the roles and responsibilities that we've embedded within GB Bank. Data architecture and design. Very lucky we have a solutions architect with the GB Bank, very, very good one, help design the systems, help design the flow of data. But as an information governance specialist, it's really, really good that you understand those flows of data, you understand where your data is coming into the organisation, where it's flowing, where it's meeting other systems, and where it actually ends up. So you understand the whole data flow and lineage within your organisation. And the last one is technology. What systems have you got out there and what does it deliver to the business? Have your teams got the systems and the technology they need to be able to do the job they need? Again, very, very important as part of data governance. Next slide, please. So whilst you're building your framework, there are some principles that we've had to embed within GB Bank. And these, again, some of the list of the very important principles for me, things that have guided me whilst developing the framework. Consistency of data to avoid unnecessary duplication. That can send your MI right the way out the window, so it's really important duplication doesn't occur. And you put some controls in place to identify that through the journey of the data. Data quality, obvious one. Make sure that the data that you're collecting and harnessing and bringing MI from is good quality data. You have to put continual checks into that data. It's got to be monitored on a continual basis. Don't always sit there and think it's right. You need to provide assurances, or your organisation needs to provide assurance. The information asset owner needs to provide assurance that the data within their business, area of business, can be relied upon. Ownership and accountability, I've mentioned that. But that, again, that needs to be kept up to date. So if there's any movement within the organisation, make sure that somebody leaves that role, somebody else is appointed. They understand their roles, they understand their responsibilities. Data definitions. What you find sometimes is a system, a name, a label may be different in one system as it is in the other, but in actual fact, the data actually means the same. So if your data is traveling down and ending up in a single customer view, how does that work? Make sure that you understand the interpretation of the data within each of the systems. Value, harness your data, ensure that there's a culture of valuing your data within your organisation. A lot of that is driven by the information asset owner, but you're there to assist them and to push them and make sure that data is continually on the agenda. Keep data secure. Of course, you need to. It's a principle of the Data Protection Act, but don't lock it down so it becomes nobody can gain access to it. What you don't want to do is become a hindrance to the organisation. You need to help people. So ensure that data needs to be locked down. That data is available to those people who need to access it. Trust, again, similar to data quality, ensure that your data is trustworthy. And oversight, the last one. We have a data governance council where our data asset owners and data managers feed into. We have meetings. They oversee our data strategy and provide guidance and collective response about the direction of travel of the organisation. Next slide. So what did I do? So as I said, I've been there since December 2020. Once I arrived, the focus really was on data privacy, to get the foundation of data protection in place, to do your DPIAs, do the ROPAs. And then when we started having customer data, that's when the focus changed to data governance, to make sure that that governance that we had in place was working. How was I going to assess that? The only way I could have assessed that is by doing a data maturity assessment. I didn't expect us to be fairly high. Of course, we were a startup. Only expected us to be about 1 or 2 in most of the disciplines listed there. But I needed a foundation. I needed some building blocks for us to build on. So what I did was set up workshops, listen to the staff, listen to the people out there doing the work on a day-to-day basis. We had a different workshop for each one of those 4 elements. And we discussed those 3 elements in one of those workshops. And from their responses, from what I knew, we were able to assess where we were on our data maturity journey in each of those 4 elements. And from there, what we did was developed an action plan. We looked for very quick wins, things that maybe we need a little bit more financial investment in, and therefore that needs to wait. But what it does was it helps us, sets us our action plan off for the next year, potentially the next 18 months, where we will revisit it again to see whether we've made, we've moved up those building blocks and the maturity. And I think one of the important things for me to remember also, in the message I gave out, is that we can't be good at everything. We're a startup. We need to have a look at where we want to invest our time and money, our limited resources, where we want to get good at, because what's going to bring the organisation the best value. So it's really important to know that when you actually applying resources. But we're on that journey now. And if anybody's really brave enough to do a data maturity assessment, they haven't done it before, but they would like to get their hands on it, because I think it is a very good thing to do. There is a source there. That's the source that I use to do mine. Very good book called Data-Driven Business Transformation by Crothers and Jackson. And that really gives you what you need to do and the tools you need to do a maturity assessment for your organisation. Next slide, sorry. So if I could give you any advice in relation to my journey, these are the do's and don'ts. I'll not go through them all. I'll let you read them yourselves. But I was to pull up some really big ones, is that data governance is an enabler to a business. And that's the message that you've got to give. You've got to stay really positive. And the first people you target are your senior executive teams, because you've got to have a buy-in from the top. You've got to believe that this is really important for the organisation. Stay positive. You're never going to sell a product if you're not positive. You've got to always remain positive. And remember, it's a journey. It's not a destination. You're not going to get there overnight. It's a long, drawn-out journey. And stay positive. You lead the change. You lead the culture change. Data is king. And it's really important that you get that message out. And some of the don'ts that I would say is, don't be put off because you don't think people, and it's a fact, some people are not interested in data. And it's bizarre to those of us who are really interested in data. You just can't understand it, but unfortunately it is a reality. But don't be put off for it. Stay focused and be flexible. Not everybody learns the same way. You may learn one way, somebody learns a different way. What's best for the organisation? And that's what you've got to remember. Flexibility. Stay flexible at all times. Don't lose sight of the end game. That's it, really.
Fabulous. Thank you, Maria. And that was a really good overview of why governance is the sort of end result of what we're all doing. I'd like to just move on to Simon. You've got some thoughts, I think, on data governance and accountability, Simon.
Yes, thank you. Thanks, Robert. And thanks very much, Maria. That was really interesting. So, yeah, just to pick out a few bits, I'm not going into the amount of detail that Maria has, which has been really fascinating. Thanks ever so much, Maria, for that. I'm just going to pick out some general principles and things like that I've picked up along the way. First, around data governance. And this really is kind of the way that I like to think about data governance, is really the three key enablers, the three parts that make it all work together. And I think, I guess these are fairly obvious, but it's useful to kind of to think of it in this way. So one is obviously the people, is being mindful of the people and what are their roles and what are their responsibilities. And Maria talked about, data owners, data stewards, etc. But equally, the people that are actually processing the people that are daily processing data in all sorts of different ways, which is, depending on the size of your organization, could be hundreds or thousands of people. But to understand that the people, and equally what have you provided for those people, in terms of training. And the next thing that comes on from that, of course, is thinking about, so what standards do we have? What policies, what procedures do we have that help those people know what are the right ways to be able to use the data, what are the right ways to access it as well, and device control and all of that kind of thing, how we secure the data at the same time. So it's kind of partly people, then it goes on to the policies, the processes, which is how those people act. And then obviously underpinning everything that we do there is the technologies that we use, which in many modern businesses nowadays is we use all sorts of different technologies, a range. Maria mentioned, for example, HR teams that will have HR systems or recruitment systems, but equally we've got CRM systems and all sorts across our business that are underpinning it. And I just think this is quite a good model to think about any kind of situation, any kind of activity that we use data for. We'll tend to have a foot in almost each camp. We're using a technology, and there's people that are users of that technology, and they're hopefully operating to some agreed policies, procedures in terms of how they manage that data. So if you're thinking of how you go about governing the way that an organization manages its data, those are kind of the three ways that I would look at it. And then, Robert, you mentioned about accountability, which is another thing that we wanted to touch on here, which is one of the key concepts within GDPR. In fact, principles within GDPR is that organizations are accountable for the way that they use. So this is where we're coming particularly into the realm of personal data here, obviously looking at GDPR. So the principle of accountability really says that, organizations must effectively take responsibility or accountability for what they do with personal data. And that obviously means making sure that your people have got training and that they're giving policies, procedures, etc., and help and support to make sure that they're doing the right things that comply with the law. Equally, the other key part is that you have to be able to demonstrate how you go about complying with the various principles that we have under data protection law. And what kind of measures and controls we have as well, not just around technical and organizational measures we often talk about. So some of the things that we're going to be looking at, I've covered very much kind of we talked about leadership roles, and we talked a little bit about training. But things like record keeping, so having like an information asset register, maybe one thing that you've got a list of kind of all of the assets that we have across the business, the information and the data assets that we have, a record of processing activities, your various logs of data protection impact assessments, things like that. which obviously touches on risk assessments that we have next. Most businesses will have risk assessments that they need to log, and those are all available as evidence that we've met the requirements of GDPR and other data protection laws that we have around the world. Also, things like procedures for information for individual privacy rights, data sharing, and all of the other areas that we're familiar with, like data retention, information security, etc. So that's really the principle of accountability. It's, can you walk the walk? Can you be able to demonstrate how you've complied? I think that's about it. So I'll hand back to you, Robert.
Thank you, Simon. That's really good. And Mark, now then, how can tech help with all of this, please?
Perfect. So guys, first of all, Maria, Simon, that was very interesting in relation to how you guys has defined that. It's one of the better and clearer definitions I've sat on. From our point of view, I'll just give you a little bit of feedback and a little bit of a steer on what our data governance or data privacy clients would be saying to me as part of their account management teams. Maria touched on this. One of the first things is this is a hard job, because a lot of people are disinterested, or it is very difficult for us to engage with the business in order to implement a lot of these recommendations that we've touched on today. So that's the first thing, to accept that, and you're not alone, guys, in relation to that. It is difficult for the vast majority of our clients to get the staff to engage. So what we want to do is see if we can help from a technology point of view. So how do we get some easy wins in this process? How do I streamline some of the workflows? How do I simplify some of the explanations that we have? How do we track and monitor this process? So I'm engaging with people in a practical level and not on an ongoing basis, because we can, as compliance people, know that this can get very complicated. Okay, and what we've done with our enterprise workflow solution, we've sort of used the analogy of an iceberg. And we've started to see that when we're helping people with workflows and governance and policies, it's really underneath the waterline where the actual bulk of the worst happens. So when we dive deeper into this process, it is the workflows that we've created at the top layer are what is needed, but it is the donkey work in correcting data, cleaning data, finding the data in my organization, demonstrating the accountability that we've touched on in this process. So for any of this type of technology, I will always talk about your standard, who owns the data, who's looking for it, where is our data within our organization, how do we automate the collection of the said data in a unified format so that we have consistency across the board. And that's really, whether it's our technology or whether it's somebody else's, that should be the enabler to help some of the conversations, especially Maria's points, which I thought were really good, is what we would try to do with a lot of our clients. If technology is not adding simplification or streamlining your process and it's adding complexity, then you're looking at the wrong technology in an organization, guys. So really, you guys know that the iceberg is 80% under the water. That's part of the big challenge here, is to educate our organizations that that's what we need to do. If you can just jump on to the next slide, that would be great. Yeah, so what I did, Maria, and I only met Maria last week, so I thought it was very clear how you described some of this. So I just wanted to touch on where we would come into some of the principles that you mentioned. So, so the consistency element of data. Well, again, unless we're using some sort of a technology across millions of files to help us manage that consistency, then we can't track it or monitor it, and we can't really say whether we're doing it or not. The quality and aspect of data, again, we need to standardize that process. We need analytics in order for us to actually monitor and measure that type of quality. Again, likewise with the ownership and accountability piece, we need to be able to empower the people in the various roles Maria touched on to be able to optimize and streamline that type of activity within a data set. And if we can do it within a very simple data set that we think we have developed, then it should enable that process to get there. As Maria said, this is a journey that we're all on continuously. The obvious one being data definitions. Again, manually trying to do a process like that, regardless of the size of your organizations. And there'll be different people on this session, from small companies to large companies. The complexity of the data set in any organization is way higher than any of us think once we start delving into that. Okay. From a value point of view, what are our key business assets? How do we find them? How do we automate that kind of process? Data security, I think, doesn't need much explanation around, are we securing the right data in our organization? Do we have the right access? Can we change that access for people in a quick and seamless fashion? From a trust point of view, which I think for me is the most important point in this data governance, that there's an onus on us to have some sort of an audit trail. It doesn't have to be technology, but we need that audit trail. We need the optics to be able to demonstrate back to the business what we're doing as part of our data governance journey. And the oversight, again, any tools we can help fulfill an oversight committee around reporting, automation, controls, breach notification, again, just enables these teams to be empowered to simplify the process back to the staff. And if we can start getting the buy-in from an organization and we can simplify and not make this a very scary, complicated process, I think that's where technology can really help enable us going forward. So that's just a very quick summary of where I think right now technology at a very high level can help data governance, data privacy, data compliance. For people who know it's probably makes sense. The trick is getting the rest of the business to go on that journey with you.
That's wonderful. Thank you very much, Mark. And in fact, thanks to all of the presentations. We've got a number of questions come in while you've been presenting, and we had, of course, questions coming in before the webinar, and we've got to get cracking. So I'm gonna look at risk management and internal reporting. One of the questions we got was, what are your top tips for identifying compliance risks and then reporting those to the relevant stakeholders? And coupled with that, we've had a question that says, how do you manage, how do you measure success of your data governance program? So I'm going to start with you, Maria, on that. Sorry, 2 questions for the price of 1.
Okay, so talking about compliance, so compliance with data governance and compliance with data protection are completely, for me, 2 different things. They have to be dealt slightly differently. So in relation to data protection, what I have done fairly recently is actually gone through the organisation and done a data protection audit based on the principles of the Data Protection Act. So I've looked at a particular area of the business, how they are processing data. Is it in accordance with the original ROPA and the original DPIA that was written? Are there any deviations? Is that deviation still lawful? And then looked at potentially where they could strengthen some areas. So there's always room for improvement, and build recommendations. Obviously, if there is a real significant issue why we're not complying with the law, then obviously that's a high priority and something that I need to speak to the information asset owner about, which is the beauty about having roles and responsibilities and accountability, because they're the person I go to put it right. I don't put it right, they put it right. But ultimately, the end of the audits, at the end of the recommendations, at the end of assessing whether those recommendations are going to be taken on board, then I write a compliance report to our board annually. And that is the governance area, the governance, how you meet your governance requirements, that you are providing assurances to the board as the data controllers that they are meeting their accountability principle under the Data Protection Act. In relation to data governance, slightly different. That is, for me, your data maturity. So you know what you need to do. You've got your framework. Are you meeting your requirements of your framework? the only way you can do it is by doing that assessment, and that is a data maturity assessment, which will lead to a action plan to move forward on that maturity level. And that needs to be repeated on an ongoing basis. And even if you're an organisation that's got fantastic maturity and you think you're a 5, you need to maintain that 5. So you still need regular oversight of it. So that's how I would do it. And again, we have a particular board at a executive level who I would report into around that maturity level on an annual basis.
Okay, thank you. And Simon, any thoughts?
I think that was a really good answer, Maria. Thank you. We obviously are aware of other organisations that maybe not so much in banking, regulated sectors, things like that, that have still got maybe some way to go in terms of having, an up-to-date ROPA or up-to-date, having recently done DPIA. So if I can maybe speak for those smaller organisations that are maybe on that early in that journey, maybe still trying to get to that stage, I think. And it'd be a similar kind of suggestion is that you can start a review to do some kind of a gap analysis of where you stand from in terms of where do you stand from a compliance perspective? Are you meeting the basic requirements that we just talked about on the previous kind of accountability slide? I actually find the ICO's framework for this is quite a useful tool, particularly for smaller organisations as well. There are 2 kind of accountability framework tools that you can use online. One, there is a very detailed set, probably more like larger organisations would use, but equally there is a smaller online assessment that you can also use for kind of to measure where are we now. That's really it. Are we on a scale of, are we towards that 5 on the maturity, but maturity in terms of compliance I'm talking here? Are we towards the higher level, or are we at the lower level? Have we got some areas that are just a blind spot that we haven't really realised yet that might actually be a larger risk than we've realised? And I think tackling it in that way, or doing some kind of review to understand where we're at, will help you to recognise the risks, and then put a plan in place. And the key thing I think is you can't achieve everything, as we've said. You can't do everything at once. It's about prioritising where are the biggest risks. And what can we do to tackle those, and particularly looking at what's proportionate and pragmatic for our organisation. Where should we put our effort behind to be able to tackle the key risks?
Thank you. And Mark, do you have anything to add on that?
I suppose, again, going back to the enabler concept, we can't manage risk until we can monitor those risks. So if we're coming into this blind, it's going to be a very hard process, whatever our frameworks that we've developed at the back end. What we're starting to see from our experiences is, governance compliance team and IT were like oil and water. They just don't mix. They have to mix because they're 2 parts of the same complete solution. You do need buy-in from your IT and your technology in order to help you facilitate some of this. So I think part of some of the tips from a risk management point of view is get to know your data, automate the ability to bring out that data. One of the big things for our clients is they want to know, what PI data do I have in my organization? That is one of the hardest things you could do. The analogy I give lots of people is, when it's small enough, you can do it. When my children were about 8 and 9, I could go into their bedrooms and tidy it for them. They're now teenagers. I can't go in the door anymore. It is just too big a mess for me to start, so I give up. So you need to start putting some work into IT and the compliance people to start seeing each other for this type of the area of the business as one team.
Okay, that's really good. And I wanted to just follow on with that in terms of people and engagement. So couple of questions here. What tips do you have for how to get relevant stakeholder engagement? How do you make sure people take responsibility in practice in the organization? And how would you encourage good governance in non-regulated sectors? I'm going to start with you on this one, please, again, Maria.
Okay, so yes, the bank is a regulated organisation. And so there's some areas around governance and data governance we are very, very good at. because we have to be, because the law dictates we have to be, and we wouldn't have gotten our banking license otherwise. But that's just not where it stops. So there's a lot more data within an organisation and within even a bank that needs to be harnessed, and it needs to be used to drive the organisation forward for the best purposes, to build the business. Although I would have said a regulated firm's probably got more issues, some of the issues are probably the same in both. And for what it's worth, and I probably think this is an example right across the board, is I'll probably find that this is one of the hardest parts, because as I've said, not everybody's interested in data. The problem is there's some people that need to be interested in data. So you're right. It's about how do you get them to accept the accountability. And it's very, in my experience, both within my role now and my previous role, is people also have their day jobs. So it is really difficult to get them to do their day job and then also this added job around data. So how have we done it? Obviously, we've set up the steering group, which helps. So within our steering group, we have our main owners of data, our information asset owners and our data managers. So they will be part of the steering group. That helps us embed accountability and responsibility in the organisation. But it's not enough. So what we also are in the process of doing are writing it in within their role profiles, something that wasn't in before, and put it in their key work objectives. So actually, they will be assessed on their role around data on an ongoing basis, and they will have to evidence that they are meeting their requirements in that role. So those are a few of the things that we are thinking. And again, just trying to get data on the agenda, trying to, push, making sure that they understand that data drives a business. But it is difficult, and it is probably one of the more difficult things that I have found. It is up there on the agenda, most definitely, of difficult issues.
Okay, and there's a couple of questions come in as you've been talking, and I'm going to get you, Simon, just to think about these. So one is, do you have any tips for embedding accountability as a culture, especially when we have so much to do? Mm-hmm. And somebody's commented, Mark has said, accountability in governance is part of people's day job. Surely they need to see this as an integral part. What do you think, Simon?
I think that's very true, actually. But I think some people probably need to be reminded of that, maybe, that it's a key part of their job. And I think, as Maria said, getting it actually into their job objectives and descriptions and things like that can help to do that and to remind them that that's a key part of their role. But equally, I guess the other part is having the structure around it, having specific roles and responsibilities, which are for example, information asset owners, and stewards as well at the same time, so that you've got people, and this also comes back to the 3 lines of defence model, as I like to think about, so that you've got really clear first line ownership. So the example that you mentioned of HR, I think is a good one, actually, that ultimately the HR director would be responsible for the data that is held, that is managed across the HR asset, data system, but equally all of the employee data and how that's processed for employment purposes. Not necessarily for recruitment, because actually individual managers may well do their own recruitment. But in terms of managing the employee data set for employment purposes, you'd have clear ownership there. Maybe a HR director would normally be, and a steward sitting within them. So they've got clear first line ownership, but equally in the second line, you have to be very clear what are those roles, which might be compliance, legal, information security. All the people are there to support them to protect that data. And so I think having roles and responsibilities is very important, and to embed it and actually to make people understand that is part of the challenge. And I think you've got to start by, first of all, by winning over the board and your executive team so that they understand the benefits of the accountability. Because in my experience, too many things will slip through the gap otherwise, that somebody thinks that somebody else is making that decision. And we've heard this, slippery shoulders sort of thing, that it's not my decision, it's their decision. So I think that's the risk that you run otherwise. And if you can explain to your executive team what are the benefits of having a very clear structure around that in place, building it into job descriptions and making sure that people understand the benefits, you can then start to build a communication program. You can work around your key stakeholders. And I think it's also important to say that you've got some allies as well around this. So the people that are responsible for driving value from data, which is often could be a chief data officer that you have, or in a smaller organization, it might be a marketing director, whatever it be. You're going to have some very shared objectives there. You both want quality, you want accurate data, you both want to be able to understand the data, you want to get some analytics on it. There's some very shared objectives. And equally, the security around IT and security have got very similar, maybe a slightly different vision of what data governance might look like. Through their own lens, very much in a security lens, but you've got lots of shared objectives here. So if you can work together and agree how you will do that, you can work together in terms of spreading the message and getting that out across the organisation. So don't think you have to do this alone. Certainly where I've seen this working well in practice is where there is effectively a governance team. I think, as you mentioned, Maria, people that are working together with a shared objective, so you don't just feel that you're isolated in terms of getting this across.
Thank you for that. And I'm going to actually turn to Mark here. As you've all been talking, I was thinking about a company that I'm external DPO for. They are German headquartered. They're in the energy sector. They have a very centralized approach across the organization, but it's very, very IT information security driven. And I'm finding in practice that I never know from one day to the next where information is being held. So you spend so much time looking through data to try and work out how you respond to an issue. What's your experience, Mark, about actually getting the technology to be an enabler rather than a scarer?
Well, two things. That's the case with everybody, not just your German company. The control we have on our data, and I'm speaking as an IT guy traditionally, is we've none. The vast majority of organizations have none. Where our data sits, who has access to it, where is there multiple copies, is there duplicates? That's a critical part of this evolution of the compliance type of functionality, which is still maturing, is going to help massively with that. And it should ultimately lead to less data in organizations. So the enabler has to be there from technology, because you can't do it manually, but that technology has to be simple enough that you can implement it and get the benefits. If it becomes the complexity, then you're just replacing one problem with another problem. So, we cannot manage what we don't know. I say that to everybody as the first sentence. We cannot implement risk management until we know where our risks are. And when we know that, we can do something about it. So that is the starting point for us, is to get a handle on your data. Take a deep breath when you're about to do this, because it's going to be a lot bigger and more complex than you think. I mean, if you think very simply on the privacy side, a DSAR for an ex-employee right to be forgotten, and just take email in an organization of 300 people, you might have 20 million emails, right? I got to go and find some PII data across 20 million emails within 30 days. I am not the IT person. I don't know which IT person to ask. When I do, I don't have to remember to follow up with them because they're going to ignore me on the first couple of times I ask them. So those data collection workflows, you need to just accept that they're there, that it's complicated, but then you got to get yourself some help from technology. So that's the way I would probably look at that.
Okay. And Maria, in terms of what I described, do you recognize that sort of challenge?
Absolutely. Not necessarily the DSAR one, absolutely. Not necessarily in the job I'm in now, but previously when I was in the police force. I mean, you can imagine how complex DSARs were within a police force. And the amount of data we held was extraordinary. and it was very, very difficult to even the email system, the example you gave in the email system that we had truncated at 10,000. So we could only go back 10,000. But that's what, if you put a keyword in to get those emails from the system with a keyword, it would truncate at 10,000. You'd have to go through 10,000 emails. It was just ridiculous. So yes. Yes, but again, every organisation is very different. Obviously, we're very new. And this is the advantage of having of getting data governance in right at the very beginning of an organisation, because you can tackle this as opposed to an established organisation where data wasn't king, wasn't thought of. Privacy was probably was prior to the GDPR, so wasn't really up there on the agenda. Although we did have a Data Protection Act, it wasn't up there on the agenda. And then you're left with an organisation with years and years of data, very old technology. How are you going to meet your legislative requirements? It is a nightmare.
Okay, that's good. And, you know, when it is useful when you start with a clean sheet as a new business. If you're coming into the role in a large organisation with a history, I think the challenge that we face, and I'm going to get you, Simon, just to talk about this. One of the questions we've had is, how do you manage the tension that exists between a business that wants to use all the data versus compliance or IT that need to control access to it? How do you find that? How do you manage that balance, Simon?
That's an interesting one. So I guess let's start from first principles, that just the people that need access to the data should have access to the data. So from that point of view, I think in terms of looking at a business that wants to access all of the data and wants to be able to presumably do that so that they can gain more value, more benefit for customers, and just achieve more as an organization, hopefully to grow their revenues. If that's what an organization is looking to do, I very much think that in terms of data governance and compliance, from that point of view, we should be helping people enable them to do that. Yes, we've got to put a control framework around it. We've got to be able to protect people's data assets, you know, protect the data that we're protecting. But ultimately, we're trying to do that to help to support organizations, and particularly in terms of, you know, in an age where there are many, many ways that organizations can use data, can gain more value, can gain more analytics, and therefore identify more ways that they can use the data to benefit customers or patients, whichever it be, whatever organization you're in. Our role, I think, certainly from a privacy perspective, is to enable our organizations to do that whilst protecting the rights and the freedoms of those individuals at the same time. So that for me is a bit of the essence of governance, really. It's to enable your business to flourish and achieve all its objectives, but at the same time make sure that the right controls and protections are in place. One of those is access controls, so that the right people have access to the right systems to be able to do the agreed things. So therefore, you need to know what is it that people in specific roles are supposed to be doing with that data, and have a structure for if that changes. So if somebody needs to have new permissions, needs to do some new things with the data, that you've got a framework by which that can be agreed, give people access to that data, unless, of course, they shouldn't be having access to do that. So I think that's quite an interesting one. I hope that's a helpful answer.
Thank you, Simon. So we've described the fact that accountability is demonstrated by the policies and the procedures that the business has. When things go wrong, we all know that the regulator says, can I please see your program? Can I please see how you engage and train individuals? What do you do about, and I'll start actually with Maria, and then I'm going to ask Simon and Mark, and then we're probably running out of time. How do you make sure people actually read policies, acknowledge them, and abide by them? Maria.
Right, okay, that's a very interesting one. So if I can give you an example of the recent journey I've been through, is we have quite a lot of policies around how we manage data within GB Bank. And as part of the data maturity exercise, I thought I had it pinned down. We've got all the policies we need. I've gone through the whole suite. They're there. I knew where they were. I had advertised quite a lot of where they were. But when we did the maturity exercise and we came across the policies, it became obvious that many staff didn't know where to locate them. So you may be sitting on your laurels thinking, no, job done, ticking the box. The thing is, what's the point of having a policy if your staff's not reading it? It's not delivering to the business what you wanted to deliver. So regardless of where you're coming from in your direction and the fact, well, I did them all, I've told them where it is, you need to start thinking about, all right, have a different trail of thought. They're clearly not getting the message about where they are. They're clearly not being able to access them easily. So we need to look for some solutions around that. The type of policy as well. So accessibility in relation to the policy is an issue. Also the type of policy there is. So it also came about from the maturity assessment that sometimes policies are too long, too wordy. Is there another way to deliver it? Not everybody learns the same way, and you haven't got to lose sight of what's important to you. What's important is that the individual reading it or has to read it or is processing that data on a daily basis knows exactly what they need to do. So you have to gear how you deliver that message around the consumer. That's just how it is. So you need to, if that's the message you're getting, you need to relook, reevaluate, and maybe think of another way of making sure that that's digested by the reader and the member of staff.
Okay, and how, Mark, do you see technology being able to test people's understanding of a particular governance requirement? Do you try and trick them to opening a link they shouldn't be opening, etc., etc.?
Well, you possibly could, but if we take your question on the, how do we track policies, and my answer is use technology to spoon feed them. So if we just take one of our modules, now you don't have to do it with technology, you can do it manually, but if we take one of our policy management module in our suite, that is where you upload your policies, right? If your users need to physically notify the process that you have in your framework that they've read a policy, you want those policies to be popping up on their screen when you want them to say, please scroll down here, read this and tick it. How many people will actually read it? Very few, but that is the process. When we update our policies, how do we get that across 600 people in our organization? So from an auditing and accountability point of view, we know these policies are in a location, they can't be edited, we know who's read them. A system can say, hey, these 14 people have not actually looked at the latest employee handbook updates. They will be re-notified. So really spoon feed them into doing what they need to do. And if we can do that in a very simple way for the users, they will help us. It's when it gets complicated, I don't know what I need to do here, I'm going to do nothing, is when it becomes a much harder job for the compliance teams.
Yeah. And I see instances where you just get weary of the technology leaping out at you and you just put it in the too hard tray. Anyway, we've got 2 minutes left, so I'm going to ask you, Mark, for any closing thoughts for everybody.
My closing are two things. First of all, I think the definition and the slides Maria went through are very succinct and very helpful. I'm definitely going to be using those, Maria, again, myself, talking to clients. I think from empower the process and simplify it using technology if that's something you want to do. If it is not simplifying it, don't use technology. But most importantly, remember, we cannot manage or monitor what we don't know. So we need a mechanism to understand, to data harvest underneath that water level. That's important for the likes of Maria to be able to do her job effectively.
Super. And Maria, any final takeaways?
I'm not sure whether it's a takeaway. It's probably in the back of a question, actually, which I think is really interesting, and things may change in the near future. and that is the potential conflict between if you're a data protection officer and the head of data governance or information governance. My view was that the GDPR had a very clear requirement that there was no conflict of interest within a data protection officer's role. Do I think the head of information management presents that conflict? No, I don't. I think there's certain roles that do. I don't think the head of information management is, as long as this is a strategic role and you don't get into processing data or for a particular purpose or defining a purpose for processing data, you have that strategic overview of it. But the new bill gets rid of the data protection officer's role in effect and brings in a senior responsible individual who sits on the board. Anybody who sits on the board for me is going to be an information asset owner. So it's just a takeaway to think about what does that mean for the role of the conflict that may occur in organisations moving forward. So it's a really interesting one to watch.
Thank you for that, and thank you on behalf of the panel. This has been really good. I'm going to hand back to you, Simon.
Thank you very much. Thanks to everyone else on the panel, and thanks to everyone that's been popping questions and chats and things for us today. That's been really useful. I'm going to keep it very succinct because we are up to time now. So I'll just say, yeah, big thanks to everyone. I hope you've all found it very useful and enjoyable today. And a reminder that we'll be dropping you a line with a link to the video recording about this time tomorrow. Okay, bye everyone. Take care.